The mistake we make is thinking that global power is decided only by who has the biggest army or the most land. But the truth is much more sudden. Power shifts when one group masters a new tool, while the rest of the world keeps using the old ways. There is a huge error in how we think about the rise of Western empires. We assume they won because they were smarter or better at fighting. But in the 1400s, the world was actually balanced, and most people lived under the same types of rules. The global system relied on simple trade and animal power, stable, slow, and seemingly impossible to change. Yet, in just a few centuries, this old balance of power shattered into pieces. It didn't happen because of a secret plot or better genes. It happened because a small group of people found ways to turn nature into energy, while everyone else stayed trapped in the past. If you looked at the world in 1450, you would see a superpower like China at its peak. Their government controlled the largest ships and the most advanced navigation tools in history. They had more money and more people than all of Europe combined. But they had a problem at the very top of their government. They chose to stop exploring and focus only on protecting what they already had. They closed their borders and let their great ships rot in the harbor. At the exact same time, smaller nations in the West were desperate for a way to reach the wealth of the East. They were forced to innovate because they had no other way to survive. This is the story of how a massive gap in technology moved the center of the world. Before we look at the first invention that changed everything, tell me in the comments, do you think a nation can stay powerful if it stops inventing new things? To understand the shift, you have to understand the rule of energy capture. The old world ran on human and animal work. It was a limited system. As long as everyone used the same amount of force, no one could truly dominate the globe. But the West began to master mechanical energy using wind and water in ways the old empires ignored. They built mills that could do the work of 1,000 men for almost no cost. This meant they could produce goods and weapons faster and cheaper than their rivals. This was the efficiency trap. By sticking to the old ways of handmade power, the giant empires ensured they would eventually be outproduced by smaller, faster nations. They were playing by the old rules while the world was moving toward a new mechanical future. The shift in power began with the mastery of wind and water to replace the physical work of thousands. Small nations began building water wheels that could saw wood, hammer metal, and process textiles with a force that human hands could never match. These machines achieved efficiencies of over 70%, which meant they could turn a small stream into a massive factory of power. While the great empires relied on millions of laborers, these new nations used mechanical energy to do the same work for a fraction of the cost. A single water wheel could supply an entire village with the energy needed to build ships and weapons 24 hours a day. This was the beginning of the production gap, where the cost of making things dropped for the West while it stayed high for everyone else. At the same time, the mastery of the windmill allowed nations like the Netherlands to physically change the map of the world. They used wind power to pump water out of the sea, creating new land for farming and building where there was once only water. The technology was sophisticated, using massive gears to transfer the power of the wind into mechanical force. This allowed them to grind grain, press oil, and saw timber on a scale that ancient empires had never imagined. The old empires had the most people, but the new powers had the most energy. The ability to use nature to do work meant that a small country could suddenly have the economic strength of a giant. While the leaders of the East focused on maintaining their current territory, the West was building machines that multiplied their power every year. This was not just about making things. It was about the speed of movement and control. New navigation tools like the astrolabe allowed sailors to move across the open ocean with mathematical precision. They no longer had to hug the coast or guess their position based on the stars alone. These instruments allowed small nations to find new trade routes that the old empires didn't even know existed. By the time the old powers realized what was happening, the West had already claimed the most valuable trade routes on the planet. The tech gap was no longer just about tools. It was about who controlled the flow of wealth across the entire world. By the late 1700s, the tech gap widened as the West moved from using water to using steam. While the old empires still relied on the muscle of animals and men, the West learned to burn coal to create unlimited force. This change allowed factories to produce tools and goods faster and more reliably than any handcraftsman could. In the old system, making a single product took weeks of skilled labor. In the new system, machines could churn out thousands of identical items in a single day. This shift created an industrial trap for the traditional powers in Asia and the Middle East. Their local markets were suddenly flooded with cheap, mass-produced goods from across the ocean. Local workers and makers could not compete with the low prices of these machine-made products. This caused the wealth of the old empires to drain away as their people started buying foreign goods. To try and keep up, the old empires attempted to buy this new technology from the West. But because they didn't have the machines to make the parts, they became dependent on their rivals for maintenance. They were a superpower on paper, but they were effectively renting their power from their competitors. The gap was no longer just about who had the better tools, but who owned the means to make them. The old empires also struggled with the speed of communication and military movement. The West used their new energy sources to build iron ships and steam-powered trains. These allowed them to move armies and resources across the world in weeks instead of months. The traditional empires still relied on horse-powered messenger systems that were slow and expensive. By the time the central government heard about a problem on the border, the new powers had already arrived with superior force. The tech gap had created a world where the fast and the mechanical could dominate the slow and the manual. In the fourth stage of the collapse, the tech gap became a military reality that the old empires could not ignore. The West moved from using simple iron to high-quality steel, mass-producing cannons and rifles that could fire faster and further than anything seen before. A single ship powered by steam and armed with modern artillery could now defeat an entire fleet of wooden sailing vessels. The old empires tried to build their own modern armies, but they hit the infrastructure wall. They had the soldiers, but they did not have the factories to make the specialized parts or the chemicals needed for modern explosives. Every time they needed a new engine or a specialized gear, they had to pay their rivals in gold to ship it to them. This drained their treasuries and made their military strength dependent on the very people they were trying to fight. To pay for these expensive foreign machines, the old governments took out massive loans from Western banks. Soon, the interest on these loans was higher than the money they were making from trade or taxes. The great empires were no longer just losing the technology race, they were losing control of their own money. Foreign companies began to take over the local mines and railroads to ensure the debts were paid. This meant the resources of the empire, the coal and the iron, were being shipped away to fuel the factories of their rivals. The local leaders lost the trust of their people because the government was now working for foreign creditors instead of its own citizens. Inside the borders, the lack of modern communication meant the center could not stop local rebellions from spreading. By the time a horse-mounted messenger arrived with news of a revolt, the rebels had already seized the local armory. The old system of power was too slow and too manual for a world that was now running on high-speed mechanical force. The empires were hollowed out, kept alive only because their rivals couldn't yet agree on how to divide the pieces. The final fracture happened when the old empires could no longer hide that they had lost the race for control. The gap between manual power and mechanical force became so large that the old system simply stopped working. In the early 1900s, the center of gravity for global wealth had fully moved from the large land-based empires to the industrial nations. The old rulers had spent decades trying to fix a mechanical problem with manual rules, and they had run out of time. The result was a total breakdown of the old global order. The empires that once controlled the world's trade were now divided into zones of influence by the new powers. They lost their land, their money, and finally, their right to make their own laws. The lesson of the tech gap is that power is not a permanent state. It is a calculation of energy and efficiency. You can have the most tradition and the most people, but if your rival has the most efficient machines, you have already lost. The old empires failed because they prioritized stability and tradition over the risk of new inventions. They built walls to protect what they had, while the new powers built engines to take what they wanted. By the time the shooting started in the Great Global Wars, the outcome had already been decided in the factories and the mines. The world shifted because one side learned to use the forces of nature to do the work of empires. The pieces of the old world didn't just disappear, they were forced to adopt the new technology just to stay alive. Today, the same rule applies. The nations that master the next source of energy will be the ones that write the rules for the next century.